Hey guys, and welcome back. This is going to be the first in a series that's going to do a deep dive into Paul. And this comes after my shorter video on the conversion from Saul to Paul, but I want to do a longer format in a series type. So this time I want to talk about the historicity and the political powder keg that would have been Jerusalem at the time of Paul. So I wanted to kind of take a look at the surrounding extra biblical text that we have about the time in which Paul would have lived and ministered. So as I said, I believe I said in my last video, Paul was born Saul, which is a Jewish name after King Saul, and he was born in Tarsus, which is modern day Turkey, which would have been under Roman occupation at the time of his birth. His parents had Roman citizenship, which would have been highly coveted as a privilege because not all people that were under Roman occupation had Roman citizenship as well. Now, Paul traveled to Jerusalem as a young man to begin his training in Torah, which would have been in line with his tradition. Paul studied under Rabbi Gamaliel. His formal training would have been in Pharisaic Judaism, as Gamaliel was a Pharisee, and would have contained a combination of Torah and Talmud. A Talmud is a set of texts that are debates about the Mosaic law contained in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Torah. Through study of the Talmud, one learns how to think instead of what to think. So through these debates, they're taught the art of debate. So the art of debate can teach you how to think about things instead of just this preconceived what to think about what it says. So this is more like okay, this is what you're told, but this is how you can think about it, and how you can debate it. So Gamaliel is actually a pretty fascinating person historically. He was the grandchild of Hallel the Elder. What we know about Hallel from Talmud and other sources is that for the first 40 years of his life he was a poor woodcutter. And he was born in Babylon during the exile, and later moved at the age of 40, returns to Jerusalem to study the Torah. And after one fierce debate, he actually started his own Jewish school known as the School of Hallel. There are many debates in the Talmud that have the Sanhedrin siding with the house of Hallel. So that's pretty much what the Talmud is a set of debates that happened in the Sanhedrin. So you might have asked yourself, if all this happened in the Sanhedrin before, and most of them side with the Pharisee side, the house of Hallel, then what changed? Well, in Roman occupation, these higher church appointments became political. It's not as it was under Judaism, but now you have people such as Pilate who is giving out these appointments. So the tradition would have been as such that a Levite would have been selected and appointed by the Sanhedrin, and this goes back to the time of Moses. The Levites were the priests, and the Levites come from their direct descendants from Aaron, the brother of Moses. So the high priest Caiaphas was appointed by none other than Pilate himself, and not the Sanhedrin, as would have been the tradition. Now, this makes sense, as Pilate was not always in Jerusalem at the palace. So Pilate would have only been present during times like the Passover festival, as we see that he's present during that time because that's when he puts Jesus on trial. So Pilate would have needed someone in the position to keep things in line. A way of saying, Pilate's not here, but let's do the things that are not going to make him angry so that when he returns, we're not in a state of rebellion. So this person needs to be loyal to Rome, and I believe Caiaphas was. The high priest rules over the Sanhedrin at the temple, and he's over everything in the temple, and he's also known as the political leader of the nation to the Jews. No, not to the Romans, but to the Jews, he's known as the political leader of the nation. So from this we can understand that the high priest was most definitely in the pocket of Pilate. This makes sense considering how Jesus was treated as a rebel trying to lead a rebellion. But what does this actually have to do with Paul, I hear you ask? Well, okay, so we're going to have to take a little bit of a sidestep here. The way Jesus was treated was he should have been arrested, which he was, and then put in the stockades at the temple until a full Sanhedrin body could have been brought in, and then he would have been put to trial under the Sanhedrin law. He would have been put to trial, and then they would have cast votes on what to do about it, which most likely would have been flogging, and then he would have been sent back out. But this isn't what happens, and there's a very specific reason for that we can get into later. So it's been pointed out to me that Gamaliel was a Pharisee, which is correct, as would have been his grandfather Hallel. Now, this is important context to have in regards to Acts chapter 5, starting in verse 33, where Gamaliel sort of stands out for the disciples. And he does this by naming two other rebellious men who were killed and their disciples were dispersed, and nothing came of the matter. Like, they went out and the whole thing was forgotten. Now, the reason I say he sort of stood up for the disciples is because I believe that Gamaliel could see a rising sentiment for the message of the disciples and feared a much larger rebellion if these men were put to death. And he kind of says as much in a roundabout way. But he also gives the idea that their movement might be ordained by God. And he says, if it is, you're fighting against God and you're going to lose. So he does give them that warning. And this persuades them to say, okay, well, we're not going to stone him, but we still need to vote on whether we should just turn him loose, as you're saying, or if we should flog him first. So now we get back to Paul. Paul has seen this happen because he is a member of the Sanhedrin and would have been able to cast a vote. And he's heard the words of his teacher, yet he sees the decision and votes which was made to flog these men with the strict order to stop preaching the way. That is to say, stop preaching the message of Jesus. Now the disciples are kind of rebellious in this before they're flogged, and they say, well, we can't stop doing this. But still yet they're flogged, and they're sent out and said, just stop this. Like, the high priest actually says, you seek to put the blood of this man on our hands. And he's giving a fierce warning, like, you don't want to cross Pilate. Like, he's already mad about this situation, and you're just going to make it worse if you keep doing this. So, important note here is that the Sanhedrin, or the Great Sanhedrin, I should say, there's actually two. There's one that is a 23-member body, and the Great Sanhedrin is a 71-member body. Which cast a vote on a judgment. So, in this situation, they've got two sides here. The Pharisee side under Gamaliel is saying, just turn the men loose. Maybe give them a strict order to stop this. Maybe not, but just turn them loose. And the other side is saying, we at least want to punish them for this. So, a flogging seems necessary. Now you've got all these people that have to cast votes on what they're going to do about it. And Paul himself says later on that he cast votes against the people that he brought back to Jerusalem to stand trial. But the question remains, why did he do it? So another important piece of the puzzle is that 30 years before Jesus is put to death, there was another rebellion which had been snuffed out by Pilate. And by snuffed out, I mean 2,000 Jews were killed because of this rebellion. So Pilate, seeing Jesus entering Jerusalem during the Passover festival and knowing about this Jewish Messiah, would have put Jesus on his radar, and because it was highly thought that this Messiah that was coming in was going to start a rebellion, a war against Rome, and he can't have this. It's not going to fly. But instead of doing something right away, he just watches. He sees, okay, is this going to lead to rebellion or is this not? So all this context is important to understand the political powder keg that was Jerusalem at the time. So we have to consider what would have this looked like for Paul. Through the eyes of Paul, what would have this looked like? Now, in his mind, Jesus is not the Messiah because no war was started and they weren't free from Rome. So in his opinion, well, that's that. Jesus isn't the Messiah. But you also have to take into consideration the fact that Jesus' body has gone missing. And his disciples are still continuing this rebellion by preaching about Jesus. Now, considering how Pilate had handled the last situation, the situation 30 years before, where 2,000 Jews were put to death over this rebellion, how is he going to, and that was a much smaller rebellion, how is he going to handle this one? What can Paul do in his position to help stop it? Well, we can see later, because he's there at the stoning of Stephen, and he would have been in the Sanhedrin trial of Stephen. So we can see where he clearly starts to line up on what he's going to do about it. Well, it's easy to see from the historical context what Jerusalem looked like at the time and what the political atmosphere, and why Paul would have felt the need to work with both Pilate and the high priest in an attempt to shut down this perceived rebellion. Another consideration is that Paul, having Roman citizenship, would have easily been able to travel to these other areas where Rome was occupying at the time. It's no big deal for him to travel back and forth. And Paul could have also been working with the high priest, because the high priest has this notion that still in his mind, these people are going to lead a rebellion against Rome. They're just out in the rest of the Roman occupied territory and here in Jerusalem, both. Well, first in Jerusalem, but then later they spread out. And in his mind, I could see him thinking, like, these people are gathering an army, and they're going to come back, and they're going to fight the Romans. This isn't good. Well, here he's got a friend in the Sanhedrin that doesn't want this rebellion to happen either. A friend who has Roman citizenship, which he could bring up to Pilate and say, hey, this guy can travel anywhere we need him to go because he has citizenship. And the fact that the high priest does have pull and weight in these other areas outside of Jerusalem. So even in Galilee and Damascus, which is modern day Syria, which was under Roman occupation and had Jews there at the time, they had their own synagogue, he can bring them back for trial by the Great Sanhedrin, because if the crime is large enough, they have to be tried in front of the 71-member body of the Sanhedrin. It's law that they must. So Paul could go out and arrest them and bring them back to stand trial in front of the 71-member Sanhedrin. So I hope I did a good enough job in laying out why, like, what would have led Paul to do this, considering the things that were going on in Jerusalem at the time under Roman occupation. The next one I want to do is more about the ministry and theology of Paul. But that's all I have for this time, guys. Thanks for watching.